In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the men of MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, believed they were the undisputed masters of the invisible war. We were the elite of the elite, hand-picked from the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, and the Air Force's finest. Our missions took us deep into the sovereign territories of Laos and Cambodia, across the heavily fortified demilitarized zone, and into the dark heart of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We moved in six-man teams, carried suppressed weaponry that hissed rather than roared, and possessed the specialized knowledge required to vanish into the brush after hitting the enemy with the force of a thunderbolt. In the bars of Saigon and the briefing rooms of Da Nang, people whispered about us as if we were shadows, and for a long time, I believed that description was accurate. I believed we had reached the pinnacle of what a human being could achieve in the realm of reconnaissance. That belief remained unshaken until the day we were assigned to run a joint operation with a patrol from the Australian Special Air Service. We met them at a forward operating base just outside of Da Nang. There were no formal salutes and no unnecessary chatter. They were just 5 men in tattered, faded uniforms that looked as though they had been bleached by 1,000 suns and soaked in 100 monsoons. Their faces were like carved stone, weathered and impassive, and their gear looked bare bones by our high-tech American standards. There were no extra pouches cluttering their chests, no visible high-frequency radios with long antennas, and no visible rank insignia to tell us who was in charge. One of them glanced in our direction, nodded exactly once, and then turned back to check the seal on his canteen. There were no introductions, no typical military small talk, and no posturing. There was only a kind of heavy, suffocating silence, a silence so thick it felt as though they had already started the mission in their minds hours before, and we were the ones struggling to catch up. We moved out at the first light of dawn. The jungle was already a thick, oppressive wall of green, and the air was soaked in a humid heat that made breathing feel like inhaling warm soup. Our SOG team kept a tight, professional formation, our eyes constantly scanning the perimeter and our weapons held at the ready. Every 30 minutes we would pause with mechanical precision to check our bearings, pass quiet radio signals back to the base, and confirm our exact position on the map. It was the way we had been trained. It was the way we survived. But the Australians did not say a single word. They did not even seem to stop. Then, somewhere around the 4th hour of the patrol, we realized with a jolt of genuine panic that they were gone. There had been no sound of a footfall, no snap of a dry branch, no rustle of leaves. They had simply slipped away from us like smoke caught in a crosswind. For a few minutes we panicked. We thought we had lost them in the density of the bush. We thought they had broken contact or been taken by a silent enemy. But by the time we reached the prearranged rendezvous point, they were already there. They were already dug into the earth, perfectly camouflaged, watching our clumsy approach as if they had been waiting for us for half a day. That was the exact moment it hit me. We thought we were ghosts, but we were merely children playing at it. We were the ones leaving tracks. They were the ones who had become the terrain itself. On paper, MACV-SOG and the Australian SAS were peers. We were brothers in arms, elite reconnaissance units hardened by months of isolation in the bush and trusted with missions that required nerves of steel and complete independence. We wore different flags on our shoulders, but we were all supposed to be the same breed of jungle phantom. I held on to that idea until I actually watched them move. My team moved with a practiced rhythm, a routine built over dozens of successful missions. We had our set spacing, our silent hand signals, and our scheduled radio check-ins every 30 minutes. Each man on my team carried over 60 pounds of gear, communications equipment, claymore mines, extra magazines, maps, morphine, and spare batteries. We were lean compared to the regular infantry, but we were still loaded, still heavy, still loud. The Australians moved as if they had stepped out of a different war entirely, perhaps a war that had been fought for 1,000 years before ours. Their kit was stripped to the absolute bone. There were no visible radios, no chatter, and no glances backward to check on their spacing. They moved as a single, creeping organism rather than a squad of 5 individuals. They did not stop when we stopped, and they did not rest when we rested. They just kept moving, quiet, intentional, and always just out of sight. When we would finally catch up at a designated rest halt, we would find them already crouched, facing outward with their weapons up, their breathing so shallow it was nearly undetectable. I asked one of them quietly if they weren't concerned about falling out of sync without constant communications. He looked at me for a moment with eyes that seemed to see right through me and replied, quote, "0." That stuck with me like a splinter. SOG relied on technology, encrypted radios, signal mirrors, and the PRC-25 sets with backup batteries. We trusted that if something went wrong, we could call in an extraction or a flight of gunships. The SAS did not rely on anything but themselves. Their communications man did not even carry a visible handset. When I pressed him on it, he simply patted a folded message card in his pocket and said, quote, 1. It wasn't bravado. It was pure, cold practicality. Their entire doctrine was built around the idea of not being found, not needing backup, and not engaging the enemy unless it was absolutely unavoidable. We were trained to be fast, to break contact, and to hit hard before withdrawing clean. They were trained to disappear completely, as if they had never existed in the first place. Over time, this realization started to wear on us. It wasn't a bad feeling, but it was a profoundly humbling one. We weren't the quietest guys in the jungle, not by a long shot. One of my teammates whispered to me on the second day, "I think they are hunting ghosts, and we are the ones leaving the tracks." It felt undeniably true. Same jungle, same mission, but somewhere along the line they had stopped trying to master the terrain and had simply become part of it. We were still visitors, armed, capable, and deadly, but we were visible. They were not. The moment everything shifted came on the afternoon of the first full day of the patrol. The jungle was thick with a heat that made your uniform cling to your back and made your weapon feel like it weighed 100 pounds. My SOG team had halted briefly to adjust our bearings and pass a low-power radio burst back to the base. It was standard procedure, something we had done hundreds of times. We were good at it, efficient, silent, and professional. But while we crouched there, whispering into our handset, I realized the Australians were gone again. Not ahead, not behind, not on the flanks. Just gone. I assumed they had moved around us to take the point, but as we scanned the trees, I couldn't see even the faintest sign of their passing. No disturbed vines, no bent stalks of elephant grass, no shifting shadows. The jungle stood perfectly still. That is a strange and unsettling feeling, being surrounded by a silence that isn't yours. We whispered among ourselves, a quiet spike of anxiety hitting the team. Losing track of a partner patrol in deep enemy territory was dangerous. If contact came, we needed to know exactly where our allies were to avoid friendly fire. We pushed forward more cautiously, eyes scanning the ground for any trace of a footprint. Eventually, after another hour of slow, deliberate movement, we reached the designated observation point, a small rise overlooking a narrow trail used by the North Vietnamese Army. And that is where the shock hit us fully. The SAS were already there. They were already dug in, already camouflaged, and already watching the trail through tiny slits in the vegetation. One of them raised a single finger to his lips without even turning fully toward us. The gesture was effortless, quiet, and as natural as a parent reminding a child not to wake a sleeping baby. We froze in place, stunned. How had they gotten there ahead of us? How had 5 men glided through some of the noisiest terrain in Southeast Asia without disturbing a single leaf? I eased into position beside their patrol leader and whispered, quote, 0. He didn't even look at me. He didn't smile. He just murmured, almost bored, quote, 1. That was the exact second I realized we had been doing reconnaissance wrong for years. Not that we were unsafe or ineffective, but we were loud and predictable. We were relying on tools instead of instincts. We thought silence meant not talking. They showed us that true silence meant not existing. From that moment on, every assumption I had carried into the jungle felt lighter, like something I could finally set down and relearn. We weren't studying the SAS, we were being shown what true mastery looked like. We had been trained to believe that radios were lifelines. Without them, you were cut off and vulnerable. In MACV-SOG, our entire mission framework relied on communications. Silent burst transmissions every 30 minutes, emergency frequencies, and encrypted codes. If a man went down, the first thing we did was key the microphone. So I kept watching the Australians, waiting for them to break that silence. It never happened. They didn't speak, they didn't signal. They just moved wordlessly and fluidly in sync, like a school of fish reacting to the same unseen current. Later, I figured out that their coordination came from thousands of hours of repetition, from a shared instinct that was alien to most American units. We trained hard, but we also trusted our gear. They trained until they could do the entire mission blind, deaf, and dumb, and still be exactly where they needed to be. At one point, our team leader whispered to me, "How are they communicating?" I didn't have an answer then, but I eventually realized it was in the way they moved. A slight shift of weight, a finger along the barrel, or a blink held 1 second too long. Their entire system was built on pre-mission rehearsal and battlefield intuition. They didn't need to speak because every possible scenario had already been walked through before they ever stepped into the jungle. They didn't pause to pull out maps or compasses. The patrol leader would just glance at a tree, a rock, or a slope of earth and adjust course by a few degrees. The rest of the team followed without a moment of hesitation. It was like they were tethered by an invisible thread. That night, back at our temporary observation post, I sat beside their patrol leader and asked, "Aren't you worried that without communications, if something goes wrong, you're finished?" He cut me off gently and said, "If something goes wrong, we either fix it silently or we were never meant to be here." There was no ego in his voice, no arrogance, just a calm and terrifying certainty. In that moment, I realized that for the SAS, silence wasn't just a tactic, it was a doctrine. I began to wonder if we had built our entire way of fighting on a foundation of noise, while they had built theirs on the total absence of it. The next day, we shadowed a suspected supply route. Our mission was observation only, verify the trail's usage and estimate enemy strength. No contact, no gunfire. To us, that meant setting up a temporary post and watching for 24 hours. The SAS had a different approach. They scouted the area the night before and then melted into position before the first light of dawn. They didn't just observe from a distance, they crawled down so close to the trail that I could barely see them in the bush, even though I knew exactly where they were. One man had burrowed under a rotted log, lying perfectly still with only his eyes visible through a layer of wet leaves. Another had blended into a bank of mud, remaining motionless for hours. When the North Vietnamese runners finally appeared, a line of 5 men carrying crates on a rusted bicycle, the SAS did not raise their rifles. They did not shift their weight. They did not even blink. They just watched. They memorized faces, noted the patterns of their feet, recorded the rhythm of their strides, and then vanished. By the time we regrouped later that night, the SAS already had a full mental sketch of the enemy movement, including belt buckle details and markings on the rice sacks, all collected without a single sound. When it was time to exfiltrate, we began our usual withdrawal, careful but hurried, trying to erase our traces by brushing back branches. But the Australians moved like they had never been there to begin with. They walked on roots, crawled over rocks, and padded silently through creek beds. Every resting point was cleaned, every pressure mark in the mud was covered, and even their spit was buried. When we passed back over the trail, I couldn't even find where they had set up their position. When I asked one of them why they went to such extremes, he answered simply, "If they find your trail, they will follow it, so we leave none." That was their doctrine in one sentence. We in SOG often operated under the assumption that if we moved fast enough and hit hard enough, we could escape clean. Our safety net was speed and violence. Theirs was total invisibility, not just visual, but environmental and psychological. They didn't avoid firefights because they were afraid. They avoided them because they didn't need them. The enemy could not fight what it did not know was there. No one joins MACV-SOG by accident. You are selected, screened, and broken down before being rebuilt. You work in teams where failure means death. By the time you are deployed, you aren't just a soldier, you are a problem solver and a survivor. Admitting that someone else might be doing your job better is a hard pill to swallow. It cuts deep. And that is exactly what we felt after 3 days in the bush with the SAS. Not envy or rivalry, but a creeping, quiet humility. It was like realizing you had been speaking loudly in a library your entire life, and no one had bothered to tell you until now. At first, we thought the differences were just stylistic. We chalked it up to national personality or perhaps even a bit of arrogance. But by the end of that joint mission, it was impossible to ignore the truth. They were simply operating on a higher plane of discipline. They didn't look tougher and they didn't brag, but they made far fewer mistakes. Their presence in the jungle was measured in grams and decibels, not in bravado or gear. While we radioed updates and confirmed grid coordinates, they relied on muscle memory and silent trust. One of our guys, a veteran of 2 tours, muttered during a rest halt, "We have been loud our whole damn careers." It wasn't self-pity. It was a revelation. By the 4th day, we started changing things. We packed lighter, we skipped an unnecessary radio burst, and we spread out more deliberately. We took cues from how they crouched low when the rain came and how they masked their scent. We began speaking less and watching more. Strangely, the jungle started to feel different, not less dangerous, but less reactive to our presence. That night I sat with one of their sergeants, an older man with eyes like stone. I asked him how long it took them to learn to move like that. He shrugged and said, "It takes a while to stop thinking like a soldier. You have to think like the terrain." I wrote that down in my notebook and underlined it twice. I finally understood what had been wrong. We were trying to vanish, but we were still trying to win. They weren't trying to win, they were trying not to be there at all. And in reconnaissance, that is the ultimate form of success. When we finally exfiltrated, it was quiet. There were no fireworks, no extraction under fire, and no gunships. Just a silent rendezvous and 5 Australian silhouettes fading back into the trees before the rotor blades of the helicopter could even kick up the dust. They didn't wave or debrief. They didn't need to. That mission changed us. Back at our forward base, the usual post-operation chatter was subdued. No one boasted about close calls. Instead, we unpacked our gear slower than usual and sat a little longer during the after-action brief. There was a weight of reflection in the room. The real takeaway wasn't what the SAS did, it was what they did not do. No wasteful movement, no unnecessary speech, and no dependency on gadgets or ego. We started rethinking everything. Our team cut down our gear weight by almost a third. Radios became fallback tools rather than lifelines. We began mapping our patrol zones with the terrain in mind, walking routes along natural cover rather than just taking the shortest path from point A to point B. One of our guys began practicing stillness drills, lying in the bush for hours at a time without moving, training his body to disappear. We began rehearsing our movement patterns like choreography. We learned to move slower, to wait longer, and to break the American instinct that constant action equals success. 2 weeks later, on an operation near the Laotian border, we tried these new methods. We moved in low and slow, took extra time setting up our positions, and used scent discipline. We sat silent for 48 hours with no communications and no signals. When the time came to confirm the target, we were so close we could read the serial number off the enemy's field radio. We never fired a shot, and that felt like the cleanest win we had ever had. Word started to spread, and other SOG teams asked how we had pulled it off. We didn't brag, we just told them the truth. Quote 1, I said once. Quote 2, some SOG guys even began asking to attach themselves to SAS patrols just to observe and study. What we had seen wasn't just a different technique, it was a different philosophy. one where survival wasn't earned by dominance but by absence. Years later, long after the war, I found myself giving a guest lecture at a training course for special reconnaissance. Fresh-faced candidates in pressed fatigues listened as I spoke about deep penetration missions and operating behind enemy lines. At the end, someone asked, "What is the most important lesson you ever learned in Vietnam?" I didn't hesitate for a single second. Quote, _1 _, I said. Quote, 2. I wasn't talking about MACV-SOG. I was talking about the Australians. Those 5 men didn't just move differently, they thought differently. They weren't just trying to succeed, they were trying to disappear. That shift in mindset changed how I saw everything, the jungle, the mission, and even the enemy. We were trained to strike fast and vanish in the noise of controlled chaos. They were trained to not exist at all. They designed their presence so perfectly that they left no scent, no sound, and no trail. In a war where detection was often a death sentence, that wasn't just a strategy. It was survival elevated to a high art form. Excellence isn't always loud. Sometimes it is completely invisible. And that realization had a strange effect on us. We stopped measuring success by kills or body counts and started measuring it by what we saw and what we avoided without being noticed. Even after I rotated out of the war, I carried that mindset into every team I trained. I taught men to move softer and to use their breath like a weapon. And when they asked where I had learned it, I would just smile and say, "From some Australians who stopped being soldiers and became the terrain." They weren't superhuman, but they were committed and disciplined. They were masters of restraint in a war that typically rewarded aggression. That is why I still remember them, not for what they did, but for how they made us feel, like ghosts trying to learn what it really meant to be unseen. We thought we were the best until we saw the ones who didn't need to be seen to win, and we never looked at the jungle the same way again.